The Queen was famous for her silence. So why does she appear to be speaking now? That is the first thing that doesn't sit right. Not the claims themselves, not the shock, not even the alleged language that has everyone frozen mid-scroll. It's the timing, the restraint, the patience, the unnerving calm of a voice that waited until it no longer needed to defend itself. But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because this wasn't a press release, it wasn't a leak, and it certainly wasn't gossip whispered to a friendly court reporter over tea. This was read out, formally, deliberately, as a will. And when a monarch's will is read aloud, it's never just about what's being given. It's about what's being defined. Let me slow down for a moment because this story doesn't work if we rush it. For years, the public has been trained to see the British royal family as a soap opera with crowns, sides taken, villains assigned, heroes crowned by algorithm. But the monarchy itself doesn't operate that way. It never has. It thinks in decades, not news cycles. In precedents, not apologies. In silence, not statements. Which is why what happened here matters. Not emotionally, structurally. According to palace-linked accounts of the reading, a previously sealed portion of the late Queen's will was made public in a controlled setting. Not broadcast live, not leaked in full. Read, line by line, with witnesses present. And the language attributed to it, if authentic, does something no modern royal document has dared to do. It names consequences, not punishments, consequences. And that distinction is everything. Because the moment you frame this as revenge, you misunderstand the crown. Monarchies don't get angry. They get precise. They don't explode. They close doors, quietly, permanently, and often with language so measured it feels colder than rage ever could. Here is where the emotional contradiction begins to form. The Queen, remembered publicly as steady, affectionate, unfailingly diplomatic, is now being described as leaving behind words that cut sharper than any interview, any memoir, any televised confession. Words that do not argue. They conclude. To my beloved grandson Harry, who chose freedom over duty, I leave only memories, for royal privilege must be earned, not inherited. If that sentence sounds brutal, pause for a second and ask why. Is it because it's cruel, or because it refuses to negotiate?
The monarchy has always drawn a line between blood and belonging. We forget that because fairy tales taught us otherwise. But the crown has never been a birthright in the emotional sense. It's a contract. You inherit the obligation, not the indulgence. You don't just arrive. You submit. So when that sentence allegedly appears in the will of Queen Elizabeth II, it doesn't read like a grandmother scolding a grandson. It reads like a sovereign closing a ledger. And that's where the discomfort starts. Because memories are not nothing. But they are not power. They cannot be monetized, transferred, defended, or invoked. They are private, fleeting, and, crucially, they die with you. So what does it mean to leave someone memories? It means you are acknowledging the relationship while withdrawing the institution. That's not exile. That's separation. And separation is far more final. The palace, of course, has not confirmed the full contents of the document. It doesn't need to. It never does. Its power lies in partial disclosure, in allowing just enough information into the public sphere to shape understanding while preserving ambiguity. That ambiguity is not weakness. It is control. But even within that control, one clause reportedly read aloud has caused a visible shift in how this story is being interpreted inside royal circles. Let the future be protected by truth. The line of Windsor must be without doubt. Let verification be done where it must. Read that again. Slowly. Notice what it does not say. It does not accuse. It does not name. It does not retroactively invalidate anyone. Instead, it projects forward. This is where the seasoned observer stops thinking emotionally and starts thinking constitutionally. Because monarchies are allergic to uncertainty. Every crisis in royal history, every abdication, every civil war, every quiet coup, has its roots in doubt about legitimacy. Who belongs? Who doesn't? Who decides? By introducing the concept of verification, the Queen would not be questioning love or lineage in a human sense. She would be safeguarding the institution against ambiguity. That's not personal. That's surgical. And yet, of course, it feels deeply personal, especially when paired with another reported passage that has set off alarm bells well beyond Britain. That name was sacred, not a brand. The name belongs to the crown, not Hollywood. Again, pause. This is not language written for tabloid consumption. It's not flippant. It's not emotional. It's dismissive in a way only authority can afford to be. Names matter in monarchy. They always have. They are not labels. They are symbols, vessels of continuity. To name a child after a monarch is not merely affectionate. It is an invocation, a claim, a gesture that reaches forward in time. And that is why the reported regret over the use of Lilibet hits such a nerve. Because Lilibet was not a public name. It was a private one, a childhood nickname, intimate, unrepeatable, the sort of name that exists only inside the walls of a life, not on birth certificates or brand registries. If the Queen truly objected to its use after the fact, the issue is not the child. It's the transformation of intimacy into identity, of memory into symbol, of something sacred into something marketable. And suddenly, this story stops being about family drama and starts being about boundaries. Where does the crown end? Where does celebrity begin? And what happens when the two collide without consent? This is where people make the mistake of thinking the will is about punishment. It isn't. It's about containment. The monarchy survives by defining itself against misuse. It draws lines not to humiliate, but to preserve coherence. When someone steps outside the system and continues to trade on its symbols, the institution has two options. It can argue, or it can clarify. The Queen, if these passages are authentic, chose clarification. But why now? That question hangs over everything. Why not address this publicly during her lifetime? Why allow years of speculation, interviews, documentaries, memoirs, and public redefinitions to unfold without intervention? The answer may be simpler than people want. Because as long as she lived, she was the crown. Any correction would have become a personal confrontation. Any boundary would have been framed as emotional retaliation. And the monarchy cannot afford to look emotional. In death, however, the crown becomes an institution again. Clean lines. No facial expressions. No interviews. No rebuttals. Just text. That's why wills are powerful. They speak without being spoken to. They cannot be cross-examined. They cannot be dragged into podcasts or primetime specials. They do not explain themselves. They declare. And that declaration lands differently when the speaker is no longer alive to benefit from it. Now, consider the people at the center of this storm. Prince Harry has built his post-royal identity around narrative reclamation, telling his story, reframing his choices, explaining his pain. And whether you sympathize with him or not, that project relies on one crucial assumption: that the institution he left will remain largely silent. So far it has. But silence does not mean consent, and silence does not mean surrender. Then there is Meghan Markle, a figure who exists at the intersection of celebrity, activism, and royal symbolism. Her power, for supporters and critics alike, comes from her ability to translate royal proximity into cultural capital. That translation only works if the symbols remain accessible. So when a will appears to redraw the boundaries, declaring certain names sacred, certain privileges unearned, certain lines subject to verification, it threatens something deeper than reputation. It threatens narrative control. And this is where the audience needs to sit with the discomfort. Because no matter where you land emotionally, one thing is undeniable. The monarchy is reminding everyone that it defines itself. Not Netflix, not memoirs, not social media, not even public sympathy. It defines itself. And it does so in the slowest, most unyielding way imaginable. Through paperwork, through precedent, through words that do not shout. Which brings us back to the opening contradiction. The Queen was famous for her silence. But silence is not absence. It is delay. And when delayed speech finally arrives, it often arrives sharpened by time, stripped of emotion, and aimed not at the present, but at the future. Because this will, if authentic, is not about settling old scores. It is about setting terms for what comes next. And the most unsettling part? The document does not close the conversation. It opens it. Because once an institution raises the possibility of verification, once it reclaims symbols it allowed to drift, once it separates memory from privilege, there is no way to pretend nothing has changed. And the palace knows that. Which is why what followed the reading was not celebration, not outrage, not even immediate response. It was something far more telling. Silence. But this time, a different kind. Not yet. And when it does surface, it won't sound like a family argument. It wasn't. Shock is noisy. Shock is impulsive. Shock is what happens when something escapes control. What unfolded here, if the accounts from inside the palace are accurate, was the opposite of that. It was deliberate, contained, almost clinical, and that's what makes it unsettling. Because the will of a reigning monarch is not a diary. It is not a letter. It is not a goodbye message written in emotion or regret. It is one of the most tightly regulated documents in constitutional life. Drafted slowly, reviewed endlessly, revised with an eye not just on the present, but on the next generation and the one after that. Which is why the very existence of a sealed section matters before we even touch a single line of its contents. Royal wills are strange creatures. Legally binding, yes, but also symbolic. They do not simply distribute wealth. They distribute legitimacy. They signal continuity. They define who is inside the system and who exists only adjacent to it. For centuries, monarchs have used wills not to punish enemies, but to stabilize futures. And that's the frame we have to hold here, even when the language feels personal, especially when it feels personal. The idea that a portion of the late Queen's will was withheld, then later read aloud in a controlled setting, raises a question most commentators have skipped over too quickly. Why seal it at all? If the intent was to reprimand, it could have been done publicly during her lifetime. If the intent was to humiliate, it could have been leaked. If the intent was to retaliate, it could have been reactive. Instead, this sat, quietly, unmoved by interviews, unchanged by memoirs, unprovoked by documentaries or public relitigations of family grievances. It waited, and waiting, in royal terms, is not passive. It's preparatory. One former constitutional advisor described royal wills as the last place a monarch can speak without consequence. That might sound counterintuitive, but think about it. A living monarch is always subject to interpretation. Every word becomes political. Every silence becomes suspect. Every correction is framed as interference. A will, however, exists outside that noise. It is activated only when the speaker can no longer benefit, defend, or explain, which gives it a kind of moral insulation. That insulation is what gives these reported clauses their weight, because they do not feel like arguments. They feel like conclusions reached long ago. To understand why that matters, you have to understand how the monarchy views time, not as a straight line, but as a loop. Everything that happens now is measured against what happened before, and more importantly, against what could happen again if boundaries blur. Abdication, succession crises, disputed heirs, competing claims. These are not abstract fears. They are historical scars. And that is why the will reportedly shifts from emotional language, memories, regret, sacred names, to something colder. Verification, doubt, protection of the future. Those words do not belong to family conversations. They belong to institutional ones. Which brings us to the will itself. Not its content yet, but its function. A will is one of the few instruments where a monarch can clarify intent without needing consensus. It does not require parliamentary approval. It does not invite debate. It does not ask permission. It states, and that statement becomes part of the record. So when people frame this as the Queen speaking from beyond the grave, they miss the point. She is not haunting anyone. She is formalizing something that was already understood internally, but never articulated publicly. That distinction matters, because it explains why the palace chose to read portions aloud rather than release the document wholesale. Reading is performative, yes, but not in a theatrical sense. It is controlled disclosure. It allows emphasis. It allows pauses. It allows certain sentences to land while others remain sealed. And that choice suggests something else. The palace wanted the language heard, not dissected line by line on social media within minutes. They wanted tone, because tone is everything in monarchy. And the tone here, by all accounts, was not angry. It was final. Let's return briefly to the phrase that has echoed the loudest so far. Royal privilege must be earned, not inherited. On its face, that sounds almost democratic. Merit-based, modern. But within a hereditary institution, it is radical in a very specific way. Because it reframes inheritance as conditional, not legally conditional. Titles and succession are governed elsewhere, but morally conditional. It draws a line between blood and benefit. And once that line is drawn, it doesn't just affect one person. It becomes a principle others will be measured against. That's why this clause, if authentic, is far more consequential than any single exclusion. It introduces precedent, and precedent is the real currency of monarchy. The same is true of the reported instruction regarding names. This is not about policing what parents call their children in private. It is about restricting the symbolic use of royal identifiers outside the institution. The phrase non-royal heirs is doing quiet but heavy lifting here. It acknowledges that someone can be royal by blood but not by role. That distinction has always existed in practice. What's new is its articulation, which raises another uncomfortable question. Why articulate it now? Why risk controversy, speculation, and backlash after decades of careful neutrality? The answer may lie in what the palace sees coming. Institutions do not change rules retroactively unless they fear future misuse. They do not clarify boundaries unless those boundaries are being tested. And they do not introduce language about verification unless uncertainty has already entered the system in some form. That does not mean accusations. It means anxiety. And anxiety, in institutional terms, is not emotional. It is strategic. This is where the conversation often derails into extremes, either dismissing the entire story as fabrication or treating it as explosive proof of hidden scandals. Both miss the more interesting reality. If the palace allowed even fragments of this will to be read aloud, it did so knowing exactly how they would be interpreted. It knew the questions they would provoke. It knew the headlines they would generate. Which means the reaction is not a failure of control. It is part of it. By allowing ambiguity rather than clarity, the palace shifts the burden outward. It lets the public argue. It lets commentators speculate. It lets pressure build elsewhere while the institution remains still. And that stillness is not indifference. It is posture. Think about how different this feels from every other royal controversy of the past decade. There are no immediate denials, no counter-briefings, no anonymous sources rushing to soften the blow, just silence. That tells us something. It suggests the palace believes the words can stand on their own. And words only stand on their own when the speaker believes their authority is settled. Which brings us, inevitably, back to the Queen herself. Queen Elizabeth II was not a woman known for impulsive decisions. Every major choice she made was filtered through advisors, precedent, and an almost obsessive concern for stability. She endured abdication fallout, decolonization, public divorces, constitutional crises, and the transformation of media itself. She understood optics. She understood restraint. So if she chose to embed these sentiments in a document that would outlive her, it was not because she wanted the last word. It was because she wanted the next words to be constrained. That is the part people are struggling to articulate. This is not about what the Queen thought of any individual. It is about what she feared might happen if lines continued to blur. Celebrity thrives on ambiguity. Monarchy cannot. Celebrity rewards personal narrative. Monarchy demands collective silence. When those two logics collide, something has to give. And the will, if these accounts are accurate, suggests the crown has decided it will not. But we are still only at the surface. Because beneath the emotional language, beneath the symbolism, beneath the speculation, there is a deeper question the palace has not answered yet. Why did this need to be said at all? And more importantly, what, exactly, prompted the Queen to believe that silence was no longer enough? Because if the will closes one door, it quietly opens another. And once that door is open, the institution cannot pretend it doesn't exist. What lies behind it is not accusation. It is process. And process, once started, does not stop simply because it makes people uncomfortable.